Ready?
Right.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Franco, owner of MCF Rare Wine here in the West Village. And this is my longtime friend in the business, Mike Folk, who owns MFW Wine Company, importer distributor. I'll toss it to him.
This is our first official talk podcast for the To Tell You the Truth, I Have No Idea podcast, where Matt and I are going to attempt to unpack all things wine, spirits, alcohol related in New York, as we're located here, but in general, just to discuss what's happening in our business, particularly because for the past couple of years, Matt and I have been asking ourselves what exactly is happening in this business, and our typical response is, to tell you the truth, I have no idea.
No idea, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we're situated in the little back kitchen room here at my shop, and this is where all of my appointments with sales reps take place, and typically it's like a 10-minute little, here, taste the wines, want to place an order, that's fine. But, you know, anytime Mike was here, an appointment couldn't last any shorter than 2 hours. So we talk a lot. And like I said, we've been friends for a long time. And it got to the point about 18 months, 2 years ago, where I started to notice that any other person I was talking to back here, when they would ask me how things were going, me in my stupid way of just being brutally honest, I would say, everything kind of, And then more and more people I started to notice were jumping on that. They were, as soon as I opened the door for them to admit that things are just very weird right now, very strange, they were ready to express very similar concerns. So this podcast was originally going to be about, like, what the heck is going on? Let's discuss all the factors that are at play affecting our business. And then a couple weeks ago, we had the Surgeon General make a recommendation about cancer warnings on all alcoholic products. And so that jumped right to the front of the line. But first, let's hear from our two guests here. D, you want to go first?
Yeah, my name is Dionysi Grevenitis. I'm a partner in DNS Wines. We are a importer and also a distributor for direct markets, and then sell our wares to a bunch of other states through a classic third-tier setup. DNS Wines has been around for over 10 years now. And I've known Mike Folk about as long as you have, because he was our rep when he was working retail in Brooklyn many moons ago. And I'm glad to be here and talk about the industry.
Ryan Looper.
Cool. Ryan Looper. I am now the Chief Growth Officer of DeMaison Selections and the Director of DeMaison East. DeMaison Selections was started in 1996, national importer, and DeMaison East was started in 2020.
Good year.
It is perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect time to launch. And so that's my role now, encompasses both growth nationally and growth with our distributor, DeMaison East. And so I see a pretty full picture.
Great. Yep.
Well, and the purpose of this particular episode was to get the perspective from the distributor importers, hence D and Ryan here today. Our plan is to do this in several phases, where we'll get more of a retail perspective, more of a restaurant perspective, and then perhaps some other ideas from there. So going back to what you said before about our first sort of teaser episode that came out of the announcement that the Surgeon General was proposing to do cancer warnings on alcohol products, that's probably a good jumping off point, because ultimately what we endeavor to do here is to talk about sort of what is happening, what's happening in the business that is bringing about this general sense of malaise. Why is it happening? And then how do we move forward? And so I think it'll be interesting. Like, aside from wine and sports and family, we typically talk a lot about we watch a lot of podcasts and follow a lot of things, politically, socially, et cetera. And one of the things that I think I had said to you last year was, as much as I find those enjoyable, what's frustrating sometimes is that you find just people talking about the same things over and over again and sort of commiserating and lamenting. And there's never any real, okay, we've identified the problem. What's the solution?
What do we do? Yeah.
So that's something that we definitely would like to come away with in these episodes, is not just a bitch fest or a bunch of commiserating, but also just some ideas, because we all have skin in this game.
Yep.
We're all deeply connected to this business. So obviously this push that alcohol is horrible, even having one glass of an alcoholic beverage is going to kill you. That is certainly one of the contributing factors. So how did you guys, Ryan, where were you when you found out that this proposal was happening?
Yeah, I saw it, and I just feel like it's part of a larger movement, kind of temperance idea that is related to health. And that's one of the big factors that has come up just generally. A couple things. More people are in tune with how they're sleeping. People have Oura rings, they have Whoops. More people are interested in just overall fitness. And this one felt like a bit of a punch in the nose, because I think it ignores a lot of other things and puts a spotlight on alcohol. There's obviously something deeper going on. I did not faint when I saw this. I think that you were speaking earlier. I think it's a very narrow audience that is actually really flipped out about this.
Yeah.
And I think that the industry, we have a strong reaction because there's been a ladder of challenges over the past 4 years. And this one feels like kind of an FU.
Yeah, the kick while you're down.
Yeah, but I actually, the more I thought about it, I thought, and this is maybe a broader theme for me, is that what most people I talk to are missing is community. And that's been the thing
you said it.
that wine has meant for me, and that wine has been as a connector for me. And I think it's one of the big powers that we have as an industry, is that it's such a connective thing, a sharing thing.
Yeah.
And so I kind of fell asleep very easily, because I do think that there is a swing back to, and it will be stronger towards popping a bottle, not thinking about calories or if I could potentially get cancer from it, but more about who I'm sharing it with, where we are, what's going on.
Fantastic point.
And to me, I think it's one of the big things. It's the opposite of an AI experience. It's the opposite of virtual reality. This is
the opposite of being stuck in your home looking at someone on a screen, communicating with your keyboard, whatever. Yeah.
So that's what I think, that maybe we've got some room to lean into that more, but I'll just jump in and say that's one of the things that, as a concept, helps me sleep very soundly at night.
Yeah.
Is that piece of it. And so is it a fucking bummer? Yeah. It's not great. I think the Times has, a lot of articles have come out. But I think also it's a narrow audience, and that people will see beyond that. You have a take?
I don't think it's so narrow, and I don't think I'm not concerned so much about it. So I sort of mirror what you're expressing. I just don't think it's as narrow. I mean, the scientific claim, is that alcohol consumption is the third leading preventable cause of cancer. I mean, that's a big claim.
Well, hold on. I could be wrong, but when I think it was the day after the announcement was made, Vivek is the name of the Surgeon General. I saw him on, I don't know, it was 60 Minutes or something. And the question was posed to him, why now? Is there new information? And of course, his response wasn't that there was some new information, but he said, well, if you look at the leading causes of death, it wasn't specifically cancer. He said it was tobacco, food, and then alcohol. Was there something else that said specifically cancer, or was it just a death thing?
The study that the main one that they ended up citing said that essentially drinking heavily, like up to a fifth a day on your own, could, lead to a 3%, if alcohol was a 10%, consuming alcohol gives you a roughly 10 out of 100 chance that brought it up to 13. It's very similar to the anti-meat cancer study.
Right.
Where if people who ate excessive processed meat every single day had I think a 4% increase versus people who didn't.
Got it. Sorry,
So
I just wanted to clarify. 'cause I
No,
wasn't
no, it's
sure.
fine. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem that our industry has with, where this is all leading, because it's quite unclear, I think, to all of us what the line of demarcation of warnings might be. I
Right.
mean, do you stop at the third? Do you go to the fifth leading cause? Do you go up to the 25th leading cause? And so next time you're buying, packaged meat, or you go to a butcher, is there going to be a big sign on the wall of the butcher shop because red meat or processed meat, your prosciutto is going to be responsible for your pancreatic cancer and your colon cancer, intestinal, and even breast cancer. And so, are we going to live in a world with constant flashing warning signs, right? And so, I think that's a real concern. And
do you think that this is like this just before and after moment for the industry? Like that's kind of where I'm going. Is like is that coming out like everyone's like, okay, now it's fucked.
Yeah,
and I'm not there. That's my take.
I don't think I don't. I'm a little bit more positive. I think it. Let's just do a thought exercise for a second and say that we have to put warning signs on the back labels amongst all the other shit we need to put on the back label, right?
Right.
And take off the back
And
label.
take off the back label, right?
Well, there already is a warning. It's not specifically to
It's
cancer.
not specific to cancer, but there will be, presumably,
right.
could be.
Right.
I think, sticking with the medical field, I think that's a pill we're going to have to take, and there will be the day after that pill. You know what I'm saying? And people, look, God, especially with wine, we've been drinking wine for millennia.
Yeah.
It turns out that humans are, and this is to your point earlier, humans are a social animal, but we're also an anxious animal. And
More so every day.
More so every day. And so I don't see the bars emptying out. I don't see people not going to get a pint at the bar or a glass of wine or bring home a bottle of wine because they're cooking a nice dinner. Will there be some people? Sure. But
maybe some of those people should be drinking less.
I think it's they're having net positive.
Totally, there is a large percentage actually of the huge consumption of base alcohol and base wine is from a very small group.
Right.
And that's been proven. I know Scott Galloway's talked about this a bunch of times, but there might be some people that are drinking, a couple bottles of vodka a day. And if this changes that, maybe that's a net positive.
Sure. Yes.
Right.
Correct. And for our industry, in so much that it exists within our sort of bubbles of what we deal with, that doesn't have a great effect because you're talking about lower price items.
Totally.
You're talking about nips. You're talking about
you're talking about the commodified lower level shit that we don't really work with.
Right.
No.
And most people the industry that we're talking about maybe includes a little bit of that, but mostly not.
Yeah, but that's this is a very interesting point, though, is because of the way it's framed, especially in a publication like the New York Times, where you have a study saying if you drink a bottle of vodka a day, you have a 3% chance of getting cancer more than somebody who doesn't. What do they put? The headline doesn't include that. That may be buried, all the way at the bottom. Oh, and which picture do they use? A woman sitting there with a glass of wine in her hand. What is that about? I mean, this is the, why are you
felt singled out, didn't you?
Well, yeah, but it's like, it's the same. You can use the same thing for anybody who's, a Scotch collector or someone who's really into cocktails. They come home and they have one on 3 nights a week. This is not, but these are the people. That's the really interesting part. The next part I was going to say is that the people who read publications like this and pay attention to health things are not the people who are coming home and eating, a bucket of KFC and downing a bottle of vodka with a beer back on it. It's like, these are the people who read the New York Times especially and see that article and are going to say like, hey, maybe I should think about this. They're not the people who had really problem drinking in the first place.
They're not the people that Ryan was just referring to.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
great point. I think there's something also to all of this that, like, let's reverse it. Let's try to, if you try to steel man the argument of the Surgeon General saying, okay, I see there's 3 leading causes of death: tobacco, food, alcohol. I mean, first off, you're skipping a major one, which we could do a whole other podcast series on food.
Yeah.
Um,
Something that's very much in the zeitgeist right now.
Yep.
Totally.
Which is a good thing. Yeah.
Going to alcohol, you go right to alcohol. One of the things that I thought was, well, but part of that is not simply the consumption. And that's why I was also curious, to your point, D, about like if it was specifically based on these studies and these causations. And if it was also eliminating the fact that a lot of alcohol deaths, if we're saying alcohol related, they're not related to the actual consumption and its effect on your body.
Right.
It's related to the effects of it, and then you doing something like operating an automobile or heavy machinery under the effects of alcohol that causes the death. So I would be, I'm not saying that as fact, but I would be curious to know if that's all
But the specific cancer claim is that the deaths of preventable cancer through alcohol actually exceed now the deaths of like say driving under the influence of alcohol per year.
Okay.
Which when I read that I was pretty stunned by.
This is I mean and
I can't speak to the veracity of that, right? But
It's impossible to.
it's impossible to quantify. That was going to be my next
Yeah.
thing. It's the same thing with like, a lot of these studies where it's like people self-report and no one is walking around with, a microchip in their gut that is measuring the exact amount of alcohol they consume and then what it's doing inside their body to cause cancer. This is all just like, oh, someone had, this is someone who had cancer. And then we asked them, did they drink and how much did they drink? And I'm sure those facts are all of these studies are so,
Well, a lot of it's correlation.
it's,
Which is a major issue.
I would highly recommend everyone type in blue zones in Google, get into that. There's something they all have in common, save one: wine and community. Every single one of them.
very excellent point.
And so we're talking about the people that live the longest. And I don't know. I think this is a moving and fluid situation with the Surgeon General warning, and we're going to see what happens. I'd be curious to revisit consumption in another 6 to a couple quarters and see if it actually has a dramatic effect.
Yeah.
And if we actually have to do something on the labels, what that does. But
I'm glad that you bring that up because so much of this, as far as health is concerned, is context, right? So if you look at alcohol just by itself, then you can see potentially the negative effects of alcohol. But for instance, you brought up blue zones, but we don't even have to go that far. One of the main predictors of longevity in life is a sense of community, right?
No doubt.
And beyond longevity, because we can't reduce health to longevity. You could live 1,000 years, but if you're bedridden, that's not necessarily a good life.
Yeah.
So your sort of sense of well-being, of the ability to break bread and God forbid eat gluten, I guess, right? To break bread and have a glass of wine is an integral part of the kind of human experience across all cultures, right?
Yeah.
And that's not by coincidence. That's because we're just wired that way.
Yeah.
So if you look at health more holistically, where longevity is a part of that, but not the determinative part of it, but rather your kind of like moment to moment experience of life and well-being. I think that might be a better sort of sensibility when we're talking about health. then you've got to take a lot of things into account. And you might perhaps think about curtailing alcohol if you feel like you're overindulging or something like that. But if it brings joy to your life, and joy is a major factor, then you have to recalibrate.
Well, you made me think of a lot of things there. One of them was, and the reason I brought up the idea of like when this announcement came out in the Surgeon General, thinking about what's the real motivation behind this. And so again, like thinking about how would I steelman this argument if I'm the Surgeon General? This is why I'm specifically proposing this right now. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me when you consider the other things, food being a major one of them. But it kind of does make sense in the sense that, like, how are we going to totally revolutionize the food industry? I mean, that's, like you said, that's a major conversation that's happening right now.
Sure.
That should be happening. That needs to happen. But that's a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
Okay. There are other factors involved that are contributing, I believe, to all of the sentiment that alcohol is bad for us, that I don't think are necessarily, benevolent. For example, part of it is cannabis. There's lobbies for everything.
Yep.
So, and that's something I do want to touch on. What are the other factors? But just to kind of like close the loop here on this, if we found out that cell phones were increasing everyone's cancer rates dramatically, do we really think that suddenly there would be a crusade against cell phones and technology? No, there wouldn't be. I believe there would be a continued effort to look for other things, whether they're actually causing, all of the problems that they claim to be or not, that are just a lot easier targets.
Yeah, well, we already know that air pollution causes lung cancer. Right. Are we putting warnings at the gas pump?
Gas pump at the airport.
On our door when we leave.
On your heater at home.
Yeah.
That using fossil fuels contributes to poor air quality, which contributes to lung cancer. I mean, and so that, going back to what we were saying earlier about what is the line of demarcation with all these things, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that food will be the last of, let's say they're the top three, if that's the case. I mean, we could find out tomorrow, conceivably, that something else trumps food or tobacco or alcohol.
Well, but even on the food point, I mean, if you spend even a little bit of time researching how we got to things like the food pyramid,
yeah, sure,
it seems pretty clear to me that there were way more nefarious influences on that.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's documented at this point that it was nefarious.
Right.
Yeah.
But the point is, with tobacco and now with alcohol, you sort of have, and maybe alcohol is a little bit more difficult, but you have easy marks or easier marks than food. Because once you start telling people anything about what they're ingesting as far as a food product, then you get in this sort of like libertarian moment of like, you can't tell me what to do with my life or what to eat. And somehow, because there's a pejorative on alcohol and tobacco, then the sort of right presents itself to governing bodies to be able to say, okay, I need to warn you about this, right? So that's not an insignificant thing.
No. Well, I mean, and that's, like you were saying before, stuff we've dealt with all along in this business. I mean, just the fact that this is alcohol, since prohibition was repealed, like gambling, anything that's considered a vice, then there's all kinds of hands like this all the way out being like, let's go. And this is just an extension of that. Like, it's an easy target is what I guess what I mean.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
I mean, the alcohol lobby is considerable too.
Yes.
In the United States. So let's not pretend
not the good parts of the alcohol lobby. That's the problem. Again, getting back to what we do here, we're tiny operators selling, tiny production, highly geeky stuff. The alcohol lobby, which is just vestiges of organized crime. Let's be honest; these behemoth distributors own all the local state houses, and they're the ones selling what you were saying before are the likely problematic items. you know.
Yeah.
Right. And they've done a lot to try and make it as difficult as possible for guys like us
to
protect
to
their
do it.
monopolies.
Exactly.
And you mentioned cannabis before. We gotta at least be honest that those same lobbyists were the ones crushing cannabis for the last, you know, however many decades.
We don't know who our friend or foe is at any given moment.
This is very true. Yeah. There's plenty for what we do. Again, we have probably more enemies in the industry, in the industry part of this industry, the big, you know, the people who drive trucks with George Clooney on the side and stuff like that. That's, you know, it's anyway. Really quickly, I just wanted to say, you were saying before, you guys both mentioned community and coming together, and we talked about studies that have, you know, very flimsy conclusions. One of if not the greatest medical study ever, very famous one, and forgive me because I don't remember who did it, but it was, and I think it was somebody from Harvard. I could be wrong, but they studied people over the course of literally a century. And they came to the conclusion the number one indicator of length and quality of life is number of genuine friends or family members. Like
Wow.
true, it's the most solid study ever. So again, I mean, in an era where we're all being driven apart from each other, whether or not it's by design, we can have another conversation about that. This is, I mean, it's staring us right in the face. What brings people together makes lives better and longer and happier. So,
Here.
Yeah. And I think that's a good how. I think that's something we should come back to a little bit in terms of, as we get a little bit further into this, trying to at least find some silver linings or create a bit of a roadmap as to how to proceed. But if we zoom out a little bit, because we touched a lot on the Surgeon General thing and all the attacks on alcohol, the other factors that we should delve into a bit, cannabis. Ryan, you touched on the the Oura rings, and I don't know what hoops are. You might have talked
That's
about that
a
a little
whoop.
bit. Okay,
That's a whoop right there.
a loop or a
Basically-
hoop?
Whoop.
Oh, a whoop.
A whoop. Yeah.
Okay,
Essentially, it's giving you readings on, there's a big
like a
movement for-
Fitbit.
like
Yeah.
sleep science is a big thing right
Mhm.
now.
It's
It's
huge.
one of the big, you see people, oh, this is how you get good sleep. And, people are measuring that. You have Ozempic, which is another big factor.
Mm-hmm.
It causes people to drink less
I'm
when they're
glad you
taking it.
mentioned that. Yeah.
And then
Well, it seems
obviously
like it causes people to not want to do anything that gives joy.
it definitely,
see it in their face.
It looks a little, I don't know. I have some friends that have benefited health-wise from it, but
Sure.
I think that
Sure.
it's one of those, it definitely is having an effect
Mhm.
on consumption. And then you mentioned cannabis and any sort of like mushrooms. I have very recently a bunch of friends that own restaurants have recounted some stories where people will come in and they'll have a glass of wine and they're totally messed up because they're doing stuff before they're doing cannabis and they're doing or whatever. They're macrodosing. and they're
That's
showing up
interesting. I've
and then
not heard that, yeah.
having a glass of wine when they might have 2 or 3, they don't. They have the
Right.
one. So there's just all these kind of new impacts, new inputs
All right.
to the industry that I think are they're just happening.
Well, they're coalescing simultaneously.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. I have a friend who owns some restaurants, and one of the things that he commented on, even pre-COVID, was the idea that, like, the bar culture, how he had seen that change so much over the 20 years that he's owned bars, to where he said, I remember I could sit and watch people make new friends, new acquaintances, whether it was just, sitting next to someone and getting into a conversation or going out and smoking cigarettes once indoor smoking ban happened. And he said, now I'll see someone come in, sit by themselves at the bar, order one glass, phone, go outside, vape, come back. They still have the same glass, and they might be there for an hour or two and they don't talk to anyone.
Yeah.
And that's become more normal.
I think there's a fair amount of, and I don't want to say it's generational, but it seems to maybe be a little generational. There's like a a situationship with wine.
So
People have the situationship with wine where they're like, which wasn't the case when I was coming up personally. It was a little bit more like, I'm really into this. I'm really focused on this. I'm checking this out, you know, a whole category. I'm getting into a new area. I'm drinking more of this. It was a lot of discovery, where I think that now there's a little bit of like a swipe right, swipe left sort of thing going on with wine.
yeah,
Okay.
it's a very. Go ahead.
I've Chris, I've thought about this a lot, and I've made many of the same points. We've all seen this. Like 6 years ago, if you had a BTG running by the glass, for people not in the industry, that was running at, you know, a high volume restaurant in Manhattan here, that was, I don't know, 60-seater and 80-seater. You know, your average rate of depletion was around 5 cases every 2 weeks. Every other week, usually on a Thursday, so you have the account would get it on a Friday, would have it for the weekend. You would order 5 cases, and now you see that it's gone from 2 weeks to like 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks, and that's just simply a matter of slower depletion. You know,
I have a theory on
at
that.
the restaurant, but. To kind of come back to what you were saying, I really have placed that on what I sort of in my mind have crystallized into this idea of the democratization of inebriation, right? So you have all these other options of inebriation, right? And whether you're microdosing, or whether you're drinking, or whether you're smoking weed or taking edibles or whatever it is, first of all, you might not even get out of your apartment.
Totally.
Never happened to me ever. to get to the bar, you might not even get out of your apartment. You know, you might just wind up playing Xbox with your boys for like the next 4 hours, and like, where did the night go? But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you had a date set up, or you were going to go somewhere, and you go to the restaurant or the bar. I mean, how messed up are you going to get? You're going to drink a glass of wine or a beer or a cocktail. You might even forget it at the bar and walk away and sort of wander off without finishing it. And I think there's a direct correlation between that democratization of inebriation.
The pies become the slices of the pie become smaller.
Absolutely, there's no question about it. And people talk about the youth not drinking wine. And who is microdosing the most, and who is the beneficiary of the sort of democratization,
Right.
Amongst other things, and other things that are in our industry which are problematic, which we can get into. Things like the language that we built in around our language being around our industry, and about wine becoming so sort of impenetrable and precious, and we're all guilty of that. And if you're just a new person to wine, it used to be, back in the day, you had to learn 3 or 4 things about wine, and you felt that you had some sort of footing. And now there are all these sort of like internal conversations about wine and the politicization of wine. That it's become so convoluted, and I don't know why anyone would really be interested in involving themselves in all that. I mean, it just seems like a huge bag to take on for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
And so I think we've been our own worst enemy in that way.
Yeah. So this is a good segue. This is what we're going to miss before. So we've had 2 major points that I have noticed as a retailer. You guys may or may not notice it because you're not customer facing, but 2 huge things are young people are drinking less, and the young people who do drink are sticking with like the glue, the Gatorade wine, the fun stuff, which is great. I mean, we sell tons of it. Obviously, we've been at the forefront of natural wine for a long time. But at the high end, these wines have become way too precious, and hence way too expensive. And for every generation, there was always like, when I first started in this business, you knew a guy who'd been collecting forever and still had like, Romani Conti bottles with like the sticker gun price of like $29.99 on it from like the 70s, right? So and then they'd say, oh my gosh, $100 for that, too expensive. But then there was always a next wave of wine drinker who never remembered when it was $30, but had it and it's like, I totally pay $100 for that. Now we're to the point where those wines are all, you know, in the 4-digit range, and there's just not the next generation, by and large, sliding in to buy those wines. And the previous generations are either their cellars are full, they have more wine than they can drink in 10 more lifetimes, or they're just saying like, you know what, I love this stuff. I love these wines. I love, you know, the 22 Burgundy vintage, for example. But they're like, I'm not paying $2,000 for that. I'm not paying $5,000 for that. And so those wines, a huge thing affecting the numbers right now for, I think, everyone seated here is when the high-end stuff is not selling, that has a dramatic effect on your revenue. But right now, no one is buying the high-end wines. Stuff that it would never even make it to my shelf because I'd send 3 emails and it'd be gone. And these people will be saying, I'll take more if you can get it. Now it's just sitting there and it's not even selling to people who walk in the door.
Are you insinuating that we have inflation right now?
Inflation and coupled with the over fetishization of ultra high-end wines. Look, and I understand that this is not just like, you know, like you can make the case that like, you know, these major chateaux in Bordeaux, they just decide that their wine is worth this much, even though they make 20,000 cases of it. Whereas, you know, with things like Grand Cru Burgundy or these traditionalist Barolo producers or Champagne producers, you just, you know, of the whatever 7 producers that have Musigny, each of them makes like 1 or 2 barrels of it. There's no more Musigny to be made. And there's, for a long time, for let's say the last 25 years, there was just more and more and more desire for those wines. And again, it's like, okay, so let's just take it outside of America. You know, some guy in Singapore or in India or in Russia, the emerging markets, China, obviously, they know they have to have these wines and they don't care what the price is. And so it just kept, you thought there was going to be no ceiling for the price of certain wines just because if demand continues to increase and supply can never increase, there's just only one way it can go. But I don't know, maybe we found that ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Burgundians are, you know, guilty of reproducing, you know, what the Bordelais did to themselves 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Look, that was the great sort of...
Or the subscription California wines did
right.
in the 90s.
Yeah. And that was the great sort of like moment in natural wine, right? That young people could pivot away from highly allocated, very expensive wines, which, by the way, are no longer wines. So when you're talking about wines that are $2,000 and $3,000 a bottle, that's a commodity.
It's a commodity. So many people have no intention of ever drinking.
Yeah. And so the issue with the commodification of wine is that when you have sort of a broader worldwide inflation and you know, issues that affect large tracts like the Asian market, you know, I mean, China is not going through a recession; it's going through a depression, right? And so the reason why the gray market seems to be in full bloom is because a lot of Europeans just don't know what to do with these expensive wines. And so there's a sort of recirculation of the wines. It's always been there.
More now, though.
Yeah, more now.
I think we're in the midst of, I've been calling it the great reorganization for a couple of years where every layer is changing. So you've got national importers want to be distributors. Distributors want to be national importers. Okay. Retailers want to be importers.
Yeah.
Consumers are changing. Consumer habits are changing. When you look at all that and then you throw a big growth cycle over the last, I don't know, up to 2020 of 10 years maybe, where it was just exploding. You could open a small company, get stuff in here, and things just flowed. Like it was just kind of like working. And then all of a sudden, we've got all these different layers changing, and we've got the models just don't work the way they used to.
Yeah. And this is an extremely salient point. Something that me and Mike kind of touched on as we've discussed it is if you want to talk about the golden era for the wine industry, especially like the specialized wine industry, it really has been. It was September 11th to COVID, to the end of COVID. It was like this really, and I'm not saying that like September 11th, like there's no reason why that happened. It just, those were like the major demarcation lines. Obviously through the 90s, wine was exploding in America and all of that. But back then it was still very much like, critic driven, and, everyone wanted the big, powerful, polished wines, or like, stuff from Chile and Australia, value wines. But this era where selling super geeky, really cool, interesting stuff from obscure regions, obscure grapes, tiny producers, like we had this golden era that seems to have come to an end. All of these factors we're talking about right now are part of it. And now one of the other ones, this is a good quick segue into the next point too, is that there's so much wine in the market now too.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. More good wine, the better. But what we have lost, and this is another thing Mike and I have figured out kind of, is that we lost like this, the excitement around new producers and new wines. And, it used to be like, back in the early days, right? Anytime Louis Dresner picked up a new wine, there was like excitement about it on chat boards, or people would come into a shop or in a restaurant and be like, oh my gosh, I've never seen this wine before, let me try it. And there would be like this kind of, again, we're talking about a tiny slice of a tiny slice. But again, this is what we know. So
but it had a ripple effect.
It definitely did.
Oh,
yeah. There was excitement about wine. There was excitement about new and interesting stuff. It ceased to be about what's a good value, what's a cheap wine that won't offend my palate and will get the job done. Like that, and again, like, I've worked out in outside the city, outside the wine bubble, and that's still very much a huge thing, right? Like, where's the floor stack of, Malbec that I can just blindly pick from?
Yeah.
Bogle, like all of those things. And again, we're not like trying to like shit talk, industrially produced wines, right? But
some of those
we
wines
moved
serve
beyond the
purpose,
industrially produced wines.
Yeah. Well, so I didn't forget.
I also
to
want to hear
mention,
your theory.
I did forget
sorry,
to mention a layer, which is also the buyer set changed,
Mm-hmm.
which is a big thing.
Sure.
So we're talking about every single piece of the business is in the midst of a major model change.
Huge flux.
And y'all were saying the word weird earlier. I think that is the definition of weird in a marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
When you have every single aspect in change, that's why we're looking at less consistency. The cadence of ordering is different.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that my theory on some of the kind of velocity questions also has to do with what you're talking about, which is abundance of choice and abundance of offering. Wine list by the glass are bigger. So if you spread the amount of selections you're pouring, then it's, you might get a flyer like a Sancerre that flies through, but the overall turns go down.
Yeah, very good point.
So you get dispersion.
Right. And that may not necessarily indicate less consumption. It's just you have more
You just
options.
spread thin.
Exactly. And so I think that's the other thing is we've got this kind of, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I've been pro sommelier. My wife's a sommelier, but we've got kind of a like sommelierification of the wine buying set where there's more offering.
Mm-hmm.
Bigger is often better.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a big impact on what it's affected consistency.
That's a very interesting point. I would be curious to know, just quick aside, like a larger BTG offering, if it still just ends up being like, the Sancerre and the by the glass Pinot Noir are the things that still turn over, and the other stuff just is there, but it moves more slowly. I mean, I don't know, but
I do think there's a kind of muscle memory going on right now where people, the consumer, they're looking for either something they've never seen or something they've definitely seen. And so we don't see the experimental side as much. It's kind of like it's a weird moment for that by the glass programs.
Part of that, I think, might also be affected by, so this is something that I'm seeing at MFW. And this is what I've sort of been seeing coming out of COVID, if we're going to use that as the moment where things changed. The value, the sub $20 retail is just cranking. I mean, those are the things that we just can't keep in stock. I mean, we really had to shift a lot of our ordering priorities to say we need to ensure that these are always here and they're never out of stock. To your point about the higher end, we don't dabble as much in that in terms of sort of like the blue chip. We're fortunate that we do have some producers that are sought after. We get our allocation, we offer them out. They sell fairly quickly. So those are sort of the two major points of the portfolio that we always have to think about. This is where the funds need to go in terms of what we're continuing to order and keep in stock. The problem is that it's the middle. It's those wines that are not under 20, I would say over 30 to 40. Once you start getting up over 30, certainly over $40, and it's a domain that's not well known, it's a region that may not be well known, that's when you start running into we're still sitting on a little bit of the previous vintage and the next vintage is ready to go.
Yeah.
It takes longer to get things rolling. So everything is taking longer than it did in the heyday.
Right.
So when it used to be like you could bring something in, you get that pop, then you bring it in again. It takes a little bit longer, but it's got some traction. Now it's like sometimes 18 months to build a little bit of like real distribution with something. And that's just not the way the wine business normally works, because you're looking at trying to run a business that doesn't hold millions and millions of dollars of inventory all the time. You have to keep things moving. So anyway, it's a little bit of like architecture of the business, but it is a thing that you have to think about because everything's longer now. Even getting things across the ocean is longer. So every single piece. And I don't know, it's an interesting challenge.
But what been the problem with that, though, is, again, that's, at least in my experience, it was that part that I just referenced that's become more of a challenge that was always more interesting, at least for us.
Yeah.
For those of us that really saw this. And I think I didn't get into wine because of this, but I think once I was I was working in wine professionally, getting to know people and sort of immersing myself in the scene, it reminded me very much of a music scene that I had come from, like an independent music scene. And because it was almost like there's this thing that we're all aware of. And to your point, like we all know a little something about it. And there is a bit of a barrier to entry because you have to know some of these things and some of these people. And then you get into it and you're there and you can go to 10 Bells on a Wednesday night, circa 2010, 11, and you're going to run into people and it's going to be a good time and you're going to drink cool shit.
Try something you've never had. Yeah.
And it's not going to be the thing that would be $20 or below on the retail shelf. And it may not even be that allocated thing now. It's all those other things in the middle that were fun and exciting.
Yeah.
And that's where the challenge lies, because it seems to me like either the end consumer or the buyers seem less enthralled with making those discoveries.
And also allocations, we've just overused that as a tool as an industry, and that's on us. Is that it really does come down to an eye-to-eye honesty with regard to allocations.
Dude, and how many times have you had a buyer say to you, someone you're on the level with, and they're like, "Oh my God, dude, this fucking company, everything is allocated now."
So and it's pulled out the special. So all of a sudden, it's made it very hard, I think, to be a good actor with allocations and eye to eye, because when everything's allocated, it just takes so much energy out of it. Yeah. And it's been a very interesting change, because then you have the new buyer set will respond to allocations of producers that are lauded. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think they habituated. They don't have the same pre-COVID experience to kind of weigh the differences. So it's an interesting moment now because you're launching things and you're like, oh shit, even now, I'm talking about distribution level. I'm not talking about import. Import from a producer, that's an allocation. Different thing. So you're talking about a situation where we've lost the energy of a major element of what's special.
Yeah.
And we can't tell the difference anymore.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's really had a huge effect
Yeah.
on, you have people going, I don't care about this anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, and DNS is a company that does deal with some blue chips, and we haven't really seen, despite the fact that Burgundy pricing keeps going up, a decrease in demand. But I'd add that, and this isn't advertisement for my company or anything like that. It's just sort of talking about the industry more broadly. I left a larger company years ago because the sort of quid pro quo system was fully implemented there, and I found it sort of almost pornographic in a way. Like it was just.
Yeah, there are levels to that.
Yeah, there are levels to that, and I felt at the time that the company that I was working for was a sort of dinosaur, a relic in using that model, because there was this new dynamism and energy within the industry and smaller producers and all this, and I just felt that wasn't the way it was going to go. Well, that was not very prescient to me because, in fact, there's a sort of consolidation of that behavior, right?
Yeah.
And I know a great many buyers at this point who work with very serious programs that have decided and often say, I refuse to work with this book or that book because I don't need to play that game. I can get all the wine I need from so many there's so many importers and distributors in the game that, okay, there are 2 or 3 producers that I would really love to have, but I am not going to bend over backwards in order to get those wines.
Here's I've talked about this for years on other platforms, but if someone comes to you and says, I have a little producer, you worked with in the past, here's what I can grab you. I'd love it if we could find some other things around it and maybe support the producer.
I am 100% on board with that.
If you have a good relationship and it's an honest, eye-to-eye, genuine interaction, you're doing good work, and most people will react well to that.
Yeah.
If you come in and do the classic quid pro quo, I just don't know who's going to react. A few will react well, but most are going to start going, wait, this doesn't feel right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm not saying we should jettison the concept or word. I'm saying we should relook at what it's built on.
Yeah.
Which is, I know a lot of people that work with you, and everyone says he's an eye-to-eye guy. He does his work. He does well.
Yeah.
That's how you get allocations done well.
Yeah.
Is you don't have to try.
Yeah.
Which is exactly has always been my premise here. Like, there are plenty of books who I would like to work with, but one, I'm not going to chase you down.
Yeah.
It's a miracle I get through the day and anything gets done. So sorry to pivot really quickly to a retailer bitch here, but like, I'm not going to come chase you down. I'm not going to come grovel to you. And nothing drives me crazier than if I play the game the best that I can, support across the book, do all of those things, and then so-and-so famous sommelier opens retail shop and then brags on social media about all the producer X he got. And I say, wait a minute. That's not right.
I was part of building this brand with you.
Yeah, I have. And that's the thing too. Like, there's been so many times, and I'm not, again, no specifics here, where I have been at the forefront of a single producer and my allocations keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, which I understand. Like, if something catches fire, it's going to happen. But then I start to notice that, like, oh, okay, I see that. It's really not hard. And again, I'm not like some crazy person here, but like, it's really not hard for me to go to another shop's website and see how much of a certain product they have.
Sure.
And it's those kinds of things where you really, this whole allocation thing and that whole quid pro quo thing is supposed to be illegal, first of all, even though, you know, that's a whole other issue. But if I've been a huge supporter across the book for a long time, And then all of a sudden it's like, well, now everybody else wants this wine, so I got to feed all these mouths who were nowhere to be found for the first 5 vintages of it. That's really irritating. I understand there's no way around it and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, that will drive me crazy. And then also this notion of like, well, you know, that producer, you know, I've been playing the game with you, I've let you in the door and you've done a good job of coming after me, but I know you have lots of cherries in your book and I'm still waiting for that first offering of those. And this is not happening now. And people, look, I get it. It's easy to get content when someone's just throwing you orders, but it's not my responsibility to hound you for that stuff. I guess maybe I'm wrong on that front.
I think you're wrong. It's not your responsibility to hound, but it's your responsibility to bring it up.
Because, but that's what I'm saying. I'll bring it up.
Okay. Because if the and especially if it's like on a rep level, right? Like sometimes reps don't feel like they might not have access to particular wines in their portfolio. That happens a lot in bigger books, right?
100%.
Some companies allocate by account.
So
the rep doesn't have the choice.
But I would say, I think what I want to touch on what you said earlier, because it speaks to me, and that's how I like to work. The idea, so quid pro quo is illegal technically, but it can't but not exist in another way, right?
I'm 100% on board with that.
I mean, if someone were to come to me and be like, I have access to your inventory, and I know that you have X amount of cases of, let's say for the sake of argument, I import DRC.
Sure.
And I would like those 10 cases of Latache.
Right.
Technically, I can't say no.
Right.
But obviously, that cannot be so, right? And if you're a restaurateur and you have a regular customer that comes in once a week, and it's Valentine's, and you have that one little corner table, two-top, you're going to give it to your regular customer, not someone that fell into the restaurant that day and said, points to the table and says, give me that one.
And I don't want that. I'm the same way with my customers. Like, you know, really quickly, like how many people, I'm a smaller wine shop. So these guys come in, swinging their arms around, talking a huge game, trying to think like they're going to impress me that like, oh, I drank, you know, Burgundy X last night. And it's like, look, dude, you're not impressing me. Don't come in and ask for things right off the bat. Like, I'm not some guy who's going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe someone's buying this for me.
So the question becomes like honesty on both ends, to your point. Like, are you honestly attempting to work with my book within the confines of the space that you have or the type of account that you have, right? And if so, then certainly you're entitled to, you know, something. You know, there's no question about it, right? And but that's not what we're talking about.
No.
What we're talking about is like literally like case requirements, dollar requirements.
That's technically illegal.
I mean, we cherry picking as a concept does not help the business if everybody does it. You can't, like, it does happen here or there. Sometimes relationships, you know, they change places, you know, something comes in, they have a relationship with the producer. That does happen, but it doesn't allow for an importer distributor to be successful if you cherry pick them all the time.
For sure.
That's just how it is.
And this ties nicely into what Mike was mentioning before, where right now we're kind of in this like this totally U-shaped situation where all the stuff that's moving in high volume is really cheap and expensive stuff, which is important, obviously. And then the stuff that drives numbers is this really precious blue chip stuff at the high end. And what's happened is, and I thought of this before as you're mentioning it, because the way I operate as a retailer is that, we need inexpensive stuff for the people who, you know, obviously I drink wine in that range, and we need stuff for the collectors. But the most interesting stuff is all of that cool stuff in the middle. You know, I'll use retail price just for people, but stuff that's between like 30 and 70 bucks. That's where that's where you find a producer before. Like, you want to, like, before a producer goes through the roof, you got to be in that. That's where all of the coolest, most interesting new stuff is, where you can buy wines made by someone who's doing really high quality work, oftentimes in a region that's lesser known, with grapes that are lesser known. And this is also where you buy stuff. Like if you want, you don't have to spend. This has been my biggest thing forever. You don't have to spend $100, $1,000, whatever. You don't even have to spend $75 to get a wine that you can build a wine cellar with. You can buy. There are great wines that will age beautifully within a decade, from $30 going up. And so that's the stuff that's all sitting right now. And that's like the kind of the biggest shame of all of this.
And that's where you need expertise
And
to be able to navigate.
Yeah.
Not your own expertise, but someone like you in a wine shop to be able to help.
And also that's where you guys, I think, would say this is the stuff that's most important to us. And this is the stuff that we're having the hardest time with.
Well, the issue is, I'm sorry.
No, please go.
Not the issue, but an issue post-COVID is, so COVID happened, right? And nobody knew what was going to happen.
Right.
The first, I remember looking at my partner and saying, well, he thought maybe the lockdown would end after about 2 weeks. And I gave it I was like maybe 6 weeks. You know, I was the pessimist, right?
Right.
And COVID happened. We came out. Thankfully, on the other side of that, and then there's huge shipping issues. You know,
That was
the logistical issues, where our freight forwarders were telling us like that they couldn't. They would need 3 months to like identify and lock up a 40-foot container coming out of Greece, let's say for us, right?
Yeah.
And so everyone, and I mean everyone, small, middle, or large, as far as importers, started ordering like crazy because everyone was, COVID had basically sucked up their inventory because everyone was sitting home drinking, and although restaurants were closed, retail was going gangbuster, and so there was business to be had, even though you suspected that you were going to be out of business, right? And then it came to a moment where you're like, oh my God, I have to start ordering because there are these massive delays. So instead of like 2 pallets of Sancerre, we're going to buy 6 pallets of Sancerre.
Well, but hold on. This also came on the heels of people doing almost the same thing to try to get ahead of tariffs.
Tariffs, exactly. So there was like
which were still there at the beginning.
Yeah, there were two. Like it was a 2-step process, right? So by 2021,
I'm just having I'm having a couple memories.
Yeah.
I'm back there for a second. Wow.
So by 2021, all wine warehouses, coast to coast, were busting at the seams. They were packed to the gills with wine, right?
Yep.
And that happened to coincide with an industry that never quite came back for all the reasons that you mentioned. You know, Psalms were in New York, wine buyers moved back to Wisconsin.
Yeah,
you know, they huge shifts or whatever. Consumption patterns changed, and everyone was just stuck with this glut of wine. And what happens in the industry when under those circumstances? You slash your prices because you don't want to go under, and cash flow has been hugely impacted, and everyone
The closeout.
It's the magical closeout, and it's now 2025, and I know this for a fact. We're still as an industry moving through that glut.
Yep.
We're still. I mean, the amount of closeouts that you see here in New York City. You know, if you go like and walk into a restaurant, you're like, it might not be your wine, but you know what the price of that wine is.
Sure.
And now it's being poured, BTG. There's no way that, say they're pouring it for $18 a glass, and you know that was a $28 wholesale bottle, not very long ago. And it's ubiquitous. I mean, it's just all over. I mean, and people are taking advantage of it. There's no better time to drink wine than today as a consumer, to go to a wine shop or go to a restaurant, because you're going to get a real deal if the people are being honest about it and not hammering you over the head. And this glut, it still has to clear. It hasn't cleared yet. It's like if you got hit by a bus, right? And you're a patient, we might be out of the ICU, but it doesn't mean that we're out of the hospital yet. We're still like have a body cast on and are recuperating, to carry the metaphor. And I think that the industry feels that way right now, where you're just like,
perfectly put. That is exactly what's going on with regard to the glut. And when you ordered the 6, pallets, it set an expectation with the producer.
Producers. Was
And
the next thing I was
then
gonna
the
ask about,
producer has got, in many European countries, their markets are collapsing.
Yeah.
So they've got to recap.
Yeah, and they've just gone through inflation, so they had to increase their pricing. Right.
And so I think it's I get so annoyed actually sometimes when we, as an industry, talk about price all the time as the indicator of things. But I think that there's a general misunderstanding of what it takes to actually import and distribute wines consistently in terms of cost. Not everyone owns an island.
It's so ridiculous in America that in Europe you can get this wine for €20, and here it's $50, $70.
It's kind of crazy.
Something good if we assume that everyone listening to this doesn't understand the business.
Right.
I would love if you want to continue in this down this track, to talk a little bit about what that entails.
Sure.
But then also, I think it's one of the other elements right now that is part of this is that, like, we're not just facing this here in a vacuum. This is a global phenomenon, and the producers are really the ones that are feeling it, probably more so than we are.
I think every producer, not every, but I think most producers are skittish these days and looking over their shoulders because the European market has collapsed. The Asian market has completely bottomed out. Consumption is down in the United States. And the United States, by the way, for a great many of these producers, has been seen, rightly or wrongly, as sort of like their foundational piece, even beyond their native country, even beyond their local market.
It's been like that for a couple decades at least at this point.
It has. But even for emerging markets, or even more so for emerging markets, let's say. So we do a whole bunch of Greek wine, and we do it very well, and we're very successful. But most of the producers that we bring in, the United States market is their number one market. Without question.
Yeah.
Some of them might not even sell in Greece.
Right. That's interesting.
And they might sell in some other European countries, and it's just like, or they might sell very little in Greece. I'd rather put it that way. And suddenly, when the U.S. market shows instability, the sky is falling at that point, because that was their North Star by which they could guide.
Yeah.
And not so much anymore. And so,
bit of a head fake when you're ordering big coming off of COVID in terms of the message signaling with the producers in the way it's followed through. The consumption has not met the way we ordered, and the market's so topsy-turvy,
Going back to honesty, though, whether it's as a rep to your buyer, same working. If we're going to think of that as forward, same working backward. Like if you're talking to your suppliers, if the relationship has always been a straight up relationship, a frank relationship, where
you're better off.
And you're reporting less than good news, right? They'll accept it. Like they're not gonna think like whatever you're trying to conceal, just poor performance or something like that. And they're hearing it from all other parts of the market, right? And they're hearing it from producers in that village or that island or that appellation that are imported by somebody else. Now, suppliers lie to each other all the time, just like wine shops and restaurants, and importers lie to each other all the time. But you can only lie for so long before
I will say that if you think about one of the things that's driven the business, it's been the portfolio and the kind of which producers you have. One of the things I think is going to change with this reorganization is that who you are and how you operate as a company is going to become much more important.
I hope so.
And I don't think that's been the case. We've been on a run where there's just a lot of shiny, sparkly, producer-driven things, and that's cool. We all talk about producers all the time. It's the first thing that comes up in the industry. It's very hard to see what the core of a company is and how they operate, but I will say with clarity that, to your point, you got to be thinking about who your customers are. They're your producers. They're the people that work with you at the company. and they're the customers, retail and restaurant out there. And they're all important. And who you are and what you represent internally is going to become just as important as the portfolio that you represent.
It used to be, for that 20-year period that we're talking, if we all accept those sort of bookends of,
The golden era.
Is September 11th and COVID. It used to be that anyone could have a notion of becoming an importer, and between these sort of self-service companies, which we use, that would do all the back of house stuff for you. It was perfectly possible, and you could even have some reasonable expectation of success. And it's gotten to the point where it feels like, thousands of distributors, importers and distributors here.
Huge growth.
Huge growth.
Barrier to entry was lower.
Right.
Big time.
Yeah.
Well,
and so my question is, due to the forces that you're talking about, are we looking, we're looking at attrition, there's no question about it, but are we also looking at consolidation?
It certainly seems that way.
It seems like both.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, I remember, I think Levi Dalton's either he wrote something or said on one of his podcasts, it posed the question of, are we at critical mass? And that was probably in 16, 17. And I just think about how many more, not just wineries, not just cuvées by producers, how many more importers are now in the market, even since then, let alone since we started in 2012. You started in 2013. Andre made the pivot when?
We started in 20.
Okay, right. That's right. You said that before. Sorry. But even in just that amount of time, how many more people have entered the game?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that, again, you can't really, at this point, fake it for very long. I think it doesn't work that way. It takes a lot longer, the cycles, getting things going, getting the right people on the bus with the company. All those things just take longer now. And I don't want anyone to fail.
No,
I really
of course
don't.
not.
I don't. But we will see some things get shook up a little bit,
Yeah.
and it'll be tough.
Well, the
Tough to watch.
consolidation piece that you just alluded to. I mean, we're seeing
Clearly, that's going on right now.
Yeah.
Yes. We don't have to discuss who and why, but there are importers, distributors right now just taking on stuff at an incredible clip, and to the that they can do that financially, good for them. But I mean, I don't know what is that.
Well, what is that going to mean?
Yeah, what does it
in
mean
the future? If it's interesting, because in the same way, I think Dee or Brian, you referenced buyers saying like, I don't want to work with that portfolio. I don't like the way they do business or whatever. I remember when certain importers and distributors started taking on spirits, and they were taking on more independent spirits, and buyers, there was a sense of, I don't have to just buy from these companies that sort of own all of the spirits.
Southern Empire.
Yeah. And that was a big change. The idea of wine distributors going into spirits
Huge
in a
change.
really serious way.
So much so that some wine distributors almost felt, I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about, felt like they turned into a spirits distributor first and foremost, and that was like their main concern.
Right.
And wine became a sort of like, afterthought.
Well, what I was going to say, what I was going to say though was that I fear there may be sort of a return to that model, not that model, but if there's all this consolidation and a handful of companies end up with all the blue chips or all the things that people seemingly want, I mean, that's like the opposite of this whole sort of democratic, independent sort of minded industry.
Isn't that the early 2000s Lauber? Isn't that? I mean, are we just returning with different names?
Gosh. That's all. These one small exciting books that are gobbling things up are going to become that, and you're going to have 17 levels of bureaucracy deciding who gets what. And this is way too complex for us to even figure it out. So it's all based on last year's allocations, and there's 5 cases set apart for new accounts and like all of that stuff, where it's just some bizarre formula. and there's there's
It'll
like
be AI.
yeah, right. Like, I mean, speaking of these behemoth distributors who were complaining about, my business has been here for almost 15 years. I have never had a solid sales rep from one of the big companies. They always give me some kid who's going to be there for 3 weeks and decides this is way too hard. And all I'm asking for is like the person who knows what they're talking about. That's all I'm asking for.
Right.
And I never get it.
It'll be funny, not funny. But I mean, I remember back in the day being in accounts that would have like the cattle call.
Oh yeah,
And
Marseille. Remember the Marseille?
And in retail, and seeing a rep from one of those companies with the laptop sort of groveling about how, this portfolio manager doesn't know what they're doing. Sorry. Well, it'll be, the algorithm they missed you on that allocation. The AI didn't pick you up. Sorry.
I think Pandora's box can't really be closed when it comes to how many small importers and distributors there are. I think consolidation is happening. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the heyday, which is, I would guess, the late 90s and early aughts when I was a buyer and you worked with 3-4 books.
Yeah.
And that you were fine, it's never going to go back to that, but there's a culling for sure, and that's happening.
It always kind of happens, though, right? I mean, when you think about history, and I'm not speaking to any quality 100%. Of these companies, but like Acid Inc. was a huge thing when I was coming up. Domain Select was a huge thing when I was coming up. Like some of these companies were doing really incredible work.
The bigger you get, the more power you have, but it's much harder to manage.
Well, that's a great lesson, I think, post-COVID. Like we, unfortunately had to move away, and that's one of the reasons why brands are also getting picked up. The way to survive after that glut was to make some really hard decisions about who you were going to represent. And if you had a lot of those mid-tier price wines that you were talking about, which means small producer, generally like really high quality, but very hard to move.
The stuff we should all aspire to drink.
Those were the first cuts, because you're like, even if they were just, you had a great personal relationship, even if they're willing to extend credit further, even at the end of the day, you couldn't rationalize keeping them within a book. It just was going to be an albatross around your neck.
Yep.
And I mean, we moved away from, quite a few producers, really across the board, predominantly from France, but also from Italy, from Austria. Like we had to.
Got to make hard decisions.
Yeah, you got to make hard decisions.
And that doesn't stop. It's just after that, you had to make maybe a few extra.
Yeah, but I also think it taught us better business practices in general. Like, this industry plays a lot of stuff fast and loose, right? And it was a party for a long time. And I think like now there's a maturation within the industry where you're like, you have to run it with more business sense in order to exist.
Yeah, that goes less of a hobby, more.
That goes for retail. That goes for hospitality. Certainly,
the startup culture is over with, right?
I really think so. And the culling is happening from people that either can't or won't get that. That you have to actually look at this as a business at the end of the day.
And it's a hard business.
Yeah,
nobody makes lots of money in this business. I mean, there are people who do, obviously, but it's like, in order to get to that level, the hill you have to climb is so much higher. The rock you have to push up the hill is so much heavier.
Listen, those companies that were, breakaway companies, you worked for one as far as like, a rep going and starting their own thing, in the 90s, up until, maybe the early aughts, where they were incredibly successful. Were that successful because there was a huge demand for companies like that weren't huge conglomerates, right?
Yep.
That need has been satiated 1,000-fold, right?
It's the same thing.
So the pie has been cut up again in so many slices that you can't just barge in. I mean, this would be a hilarious thought for any of us right now to say, to hear someone at overhear a conversation of someone saying, I'm starting an import company, but the difference with my company and all other companies is I'm really going to focus on small production, artisanally made wines that, haven't really ever been brought to the United States before.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous, right? Because that's a mantra at this point, right? It's a trope at this point, right?
Yeah.
So, that is, no one is making a killing in this industry anymore.
No.
You can run a successful business and you can do well or well enough, but the heyday is certainly gone.
No.
Did we cover them all? I mean, we got just a little bit of time, right, to kind of get to the.
I think we really hit on the contributing factors.
Yeah.
The obvious ones are this idea, whether it's based in fact or not, that any amount of alcohol is going to kill us sooner than we should be killed.
And in which way do we want to go?
That's obviously a factor. There's clearly pressure from inflation, or we can even just say pricing pressure, even depending on what you think about the fact that there's inflation. We saw what you described during COVID, where even if winemakers didn't raise their prices, the cost of everything involved in sending a bottle of wine over here went up in price. So prices did go up. The generation that should be consuming, that should be getting turned on to wine and should maybe want to learn some of these terms and get past those barriers of entry, aren't interested because they're more interested in their health. And because of the first challenge, they're convinced that it's not healthy for them. I think those are the main contributing factors. Cannabis is also another one. We didn't have to deal with the legalization of cannabis. So to me, those are sort of the four pillars of what's coalescing simultaneously.
There's another thing I wanted to add that I've had a couple experiences and some, pretty interesting conversations about is that, so my wife's an educator, right? She's on Instagram and she's talking to a lot of people, a lot of young people. And one of the classic things is, I don't want to go to a class to learn all of this. I just want someone to tell me like what to drink.
Yeah.
I don't have the time. I was talking to a professional recently who's really like open to wine, and they were like, "Yeah, everyone's always telling me I got to take a class and like get into this." I'm like,
never been a fan of that
and,
as a retailer.
And I have to say, I think we've gone a little academic on the wine side, and a little, and we're all at fault with this. There's
I call it
like
precious,
process.
academic.
It's a little overt, and sometimes people just want. I think we need to get back to like, let's just share this.
Yeah,
Let's just have some fun.
If you want to learn about a specific region, you don't need to take a class. You could read about it if you want, or a specific grape, or just about wine. The best part about wine is that to learn about it, you get to drink it. That's the number one thing to learn about wine is just drink it. Drink it and pay attention to it.
Well, and that's also, again, coming back to this idea of the community.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we talked about. If this golden era of wine has sort of died, one of the things that would help bring it back is getting people together around wine, not just at a consumer event, not at a professional tasting, but the idea of, again, going out to the wine bar, being able to run into people you might know. Having those moments where people are sharing wines and they're not making it a fetish. They're just sharing the wine with food. We've moved away from that. And a lot of it has been because we were forced to be inside. We were forced to not be talking to people outside of screens. I think there is a little bit of a getting back into the routine of those things. Even though we've seemingly gotten past it, I don't think we still have. There's a bottleneck with inventory, to your point, and I think there's still a backlog of people needing to get back to being social again.
And just the gatekeeping, it's a new level of gatekeeping that we've engaged in, and it's interesting to me that part of what makes wine so interesting to me, and I presume to you guys as well, I think wine really is, the nexus of so many things. History, geology, language, agriculture. It really, it crosses so many things, and there's so much to talk about, right? And that's what makes it so interesting and fascinating, even compelling. But it's also what gives you ammunition to make it so fetishized and precious. So it has this counter kind of effect that you have to be careful of, so that you don't create such a wall of information that it's impenetrable for someone just coming to it. And I think that's something we have to guard against.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, good point. So, okay, so part of what we want to do beyond identifying the problems and really sort of unpacking them is to try to look at moving forward. Because I'm not going to fool myself into thinking like, okay, it's only going to be greener pastures from here on out. We've gotten all the bad stuff behind us. There are plenty of challenges that lie ahead. I mean, Ryan, we've been talking about it now, but this idea of community, building the idea of this is one of the things that's been so important about wine for millennia. I was listening to someone talk about how when all the suits against tobacco happened, one of the things that came out of it was that the tobacco companies had to pay for advertising, like anti-smoking advertising. Yeah. And this person was talking about how one advertising agency they took the path of, this is bad for you, it's going to kill you, don't do it. And it was specifically aimed at kids to not start smoking. Another ad agency sent people out basically to interact with teenagers. They went to skate parks, they went to shopping malls, back when kids used to hang out at malls, and they just talked to kids. And one of the things that they came away from was that these teenagers just didn't want to be told what to do. They didn't want to feel like they were conforming and this sort of thing. And so they came up with the ad campaign of the teenager standing in front of a skyscraper and yelling up with a megaphone at the guy in the suit in the corporation that was trying to convince them that they should start smoking. And it was this rebellious sort of, you're not going to tell us what to do. And I don't think the same thing is going to happen here. Like, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be all this pushback with the anti-alcohol stuff, because the generation that's coming up and coming of age are going to not want to be told what to do. But I think there is something about, there is more to this than just getting drunk. There's more to this than just having to be a nerd. Mm-hmm. To your point again, bringing it back to this idea that there is a communal aspect to this. Mm-hmm. And we are social creatures. We should be embracing that. And this is something we've talked about a lot. It does feel that there really has been this push to not be social. This push to be at home. This push to be on Zoom. Order all your stuff online. Don't go shopping. Don't interact. I am hopeful that there is going to be a pushback against all of that.
There will be, yeah.
And wine, spirits, can play a role in that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think we've covered, a lot of the things, like what can be done. I think from an end consumer perspective, from people, just continue to drink interesting wine, continue to do it with people and enjoy it. And you have nothing to worry about. That's the point. And it's going to help the industry go forward. And it's going to lead to, a happier life for you. I don't know. You guys have any closing thoughts?
For me, I think anything just as simple as engaging with people to get curious and not trying to teach them, not starting there. Start with curiosity.
Always.
And then from just like import distribution, I would say get clear about who you are and what you do. Those would be my two main takeaways.
No, I think that's all perfect. I don't really have much to add. So,
right on. Well, guys, appreciate you joining us here on this podcast endeavor. So, Ryan, if you want to give a quick closing, DeMaison Selections, based in New York and obviously national.
DeMaison East, based in New York. DeMaison Selections, based in North Carolina. You can find me at I Am Looper on the Instagram.
D?
DNS Wines. Just look us up.
There you go.
We'll have links to everybody.
Find the Perone. There you go.
Excellent. Well, we'll be back soon with the next portion, which will probably be the retail.
Yes.
The retail roundtable,
which should be very juicy and bitchy, but hopefully a constructive way.
We have like huge retailers and little retailers. How's that gonna work?
We'll
figure it out. It would be good. It'd be good to get
we'd
some
like to have
different perspectives.
Maybe
So-
not huge, but
maybe
medium
not
size.
huge.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
This
thank
was
you.
great.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
a lot, guys. Thanks for coming.
All right. So
See you guys.
Cheers.
till next time.
Yep. To tell you the truth, we have no idea.
When?